All right, folks, I promised in addition to posting this PowerPoint, which is already posted, that I would also create a video for you, just kind of going over the content very briefly to kind of get you a better idea of kind of what you're looking at, rather than just looking at the highlighted portions, which is probably going to help you quite a bit, but this might hopefully help you even a little bit more. So, of course, our exams over chapters 23 to 25 are the respiratory, urinary systems, and fluids. And then right off the bat, with the respiratory system, you should make sure you know the general functions of the respiratory system, specifically that it's an air passageway, site for exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and the details below these here, the detection of odors, sound production as well. That will both potentially show up in a multiple choice type question, as well as possibly a fill in the blank with sentences to complete the sentences. As far as the general anatomy of the respiratory system, be more from an organizational standpoint, having columns you have to organize in terms of the structural organization and functional organization of the respiratory system for the upper respiratory and lower respiratory tracts, and also specifically noting the differences in what composes the conducting zone, which areas are a part of the conducting zone, and which parts or structures are part of the respiratory zone. That's important as well. As far as circulation to and innervation of the lungs, make sure you know that pulmonary circulation, of course, replenishes oxygen and eliminates carbon dioxide. And also that the pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood to pulmonary capillaries, blood is reoxygenated, and then blood enters the pulmonary venules and veins, returns to the left atrium, and then it keeps going from there. Make sure you understand that circulation, then with the bronchial circulation, transporting oxygenated blood tissues of the lungs, and the bronchial veins collect venous blood and some drains into the pulmonary veins. Make sure you know that general process, and you may have to put that in order of that process as well, so make sure you have that. More of a sequencing or a sequential type question. And of course, you can use that this diagram. Not that you have to do, not that this is going to be on the exam because it won't be, but understanding that general flow is important. Certainly, and I should have highlighted this, you should note the difference between intrapleural pressure and intrapulmonary pressure, the variations there. That is an exam question there. And then just part 2 of chapter 23 on respiratory system. With hemoglobin and oxygen release, make sure you understand the impacts of hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin essentially, and using this particular image as a structural idea. It'll both be in terms of potentially a multiple choice type question, as well as fill in the blank type content as well. And then going on to your urinary system, for as processes that occur as filtrate, make sure you know the different aspects of those processes. Make sure you can actually identify them specifically, as well as the solutes or nutrients that are involved at each level, at each form or each aspect of how things occur as filtrate with the urine, and the other functions of the kidneys as well, both in terms of multiple choice as well as categorizing. The nephron structure, this actually image or something very similar to it will be on your exam, so make sure you can identify the structures as shown here. You'll have between 4 and 8 structures you'll have to identify. With the juxtamedullary nephrons, make sure you know the different aspects to them, specifically highlighted here from a standpoint of multiple choice type question, as well as identification potentially for categorizing different types and effects, or I should say different types and aspects to the nephron, specifically the juxtamedullary nephron. Make sure you can identify the macula densa and its specific variants here with detecting changes and the presence of the signal granular cells and what they release. I include a lot of these slides between. It would be very helpful for you to go over them, being that some information kind of leaks into some of the other content that I left here for these other slides. Even though there's nothing highlighted, excuse me, in some of these slides, I think it'll help you. I would make sure you take a look over through them, kind of see the flow of the information I left. I didn't leave every slide from these basic chapters in here because that would include several hundred slides and more than you need to know. But the slides that were left here, they were left on purpose because the content in some aspect, some way may show up, even though it may not be a direct question related to that content. As far as overview of the urine formation, make sure you can identify the steps of urine formation, as well as the 3 interrelated processes of filtration, reabsorption, and secretion, with glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. And again, even though some of those areas weren't specifically highlighted, make sure you can understand the basic concepts there. And that will most likely be showing up also both in terms of multiple choice type question as well as fill in the blank. I left the image here is probably a good way of looking at overview of it, I should say, as well, even though this image is not specifically on your exam. This content, of course, is helpful for your understanding, if not specific to an exam question. As far as substances that are filtered by the filtration membrane, you should certainly note the content here. This image is not on your exam, but you should understand this, basically this image here and what's happening here, because that's going to relate to fill in the blank type question as well as categorizing. As far as formation of filtrate and its composition, make sure you can identify the 3 categories of substances in blood specifically and what different solutes are part of what is freely filtered or not filtered or is involved in limited filtration. With pressures associated with glomerular filtration, with glomerular hydrostatic pressure, make sure you can identify specifically what that is, as well as blood colloid osmotic pressure and capsular hydrostatic pressure, and how they relate to one another. There is at least a couple different questions in that regard with these particular concepts. And of course, certainly as well, kind of relating to that, determining net filtration pressure, understand the basic, you're not going to have to perform that formula or do any math, but you should understand the relationships here with net filtration pressure. Renal autoregulation, even though it's not a specific question there, it's going to help you with potentially a couple other questions. So I left that one in there. With the glomerular filtration rate and decreasing it with sympathetic stimulation, make sure you understand all the different aspects that occur with that sympathetic stimulation of the GFR, with decreasing GFR, I should say. Make sure you understand all that, as well as the role of natriuretic peptide ANP as well, and how it relates to net increase with GFR and GFR, and why, what's happening with urine volume, and blood pressure. In both aspects when we're talking about decreasing GFR or increasing GFR. And as far as decreasing GFR through sympathetic stimulation, make sure you know specifically the roles in terms of what's happening with vasoconstriction, the afferent arterioles, what's happening with when GFR decreases and how filtrates decreased with more fluid retained in the blood, and how it's a maintenance of blood volume. These different diagrams are not specifically on your exam, but the content is related to at least 2 or 3 different questions on your 50-question exam. Glucosuria or glycosuria, sometimes referred to as. Make sure you understand the basic concepts here, what's happening, and what that information is telling us, and what information do you gain when performing a test with urine or examining urine for determination of glucosuria or glycosuria. Aldosterone, there's at least 2 or 3 different questions related to aldosterone and its relationship with fluid balance, and its relationship with sodium reabsorption and decreasing in urine output, so make sure you understand the general concepts there. ADH with the antidiuretic hormone, understand how it's increasing migration of vesicles contains aquaporins, the involvement of aquaporins, and how it adds channels to increase water reabsorption specifically. And furthermore, that it actually increases water reabsorption from filtrating into the blood, how it results in smaller volume of more concentrated urine. There's at least one multiple choice question related to that, and some categorization of involvement of ADH. The nephron loop, make sure you understand that the juxtamedullary nephrons are primarily involved with that positive feedback mechanism, which basically involves and helps establish that gradient. That's very important, that concentration gradient, understanding that role of that nephron loop in the juxtamedullary nephrons. The renal plasma clearance test, there's at least one question, it might have been more than one that referenced it, from the standpoint of what you're essentially assessing and what you're determining with your being reabsorbed or filtered, and what is specifically, and how that's playing a role in doing a renal performance plasma clearance test. With urethra, make sure you understand its specific location and function, not from a standpoint of you have to identify it in a diagram, but how specifically the internal and external urethral sphincters play their role in relationship to the urethra with flow and function. And of course, we have with the internal urethral sphincter and external urethral sphincter a little bit more content to make sure you understand with voluntary versus involuntary response and roles of the autonomic nervous system versus having some control. Okay. Micturition, make sure you understand that's the expulsion of the urine from the bladder with two specific reflexes. Understanding both that storage reflex and micturition reflex specifically, how it's regulated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and make sure you understand all that content. There's at least one, maybe two different questions related to micturition. That storage reflex may give you a better idea, that little image here, what's going on. This image is not specifically on your exam. Neither is that. Then with our fluids, the fluid compartments, make sure you note with the fluid movement between compartments, the role of drinking water and how it basically changes osmolarity, how it affects the interstitial fluid, how it gets into the cells, and how reverse movement plays a role. These two images, actually more specifically with fluid movement following fluid intake, understanding that flow from hypotonic or to hypertonic, basically solute levels and relationship with high water going to low water, right, and gaining from more high solute, I should say, going to low solute. With obligatory water loss and facultative water loss, make sure to identify the variations or differences between the two. You can identify them. This image is probably helpful for understanding, but not specifically on your exam. With regulating fluid output, make sure you know the role of angiotensin II, ADH, and aldosterone, and ANP, specifically as it relates to regulating fluid output, with decreasing or increasing urine output, and how that plays a role with blood volume and pressure. With at least one multiple choice question, and there's at least one or two different, possibly two or three different total questions related to that content, with some fill in the blank, I believe, as well. With non-electrolytes and electrolytes both, make sure to identify specifically what is involved solution-wise with non-electrolytes or electrolytes, what can be identified as an electrolyte versus a non-electrolyte in terms of solutes, okay? Sodium balance, make sure you understand the basic concept of the amount lost in urine regulated by aldosterone. So the role of aldosterone, ADH, and ANP, generally speaking, with sodium balance. And of course, in its role specifically in blood plasma osmolarity, how it's the most important electrolyte in determining blood plasma osmolarity and regulating fluid balance. Here's that again, kind of noting that sodium balance, noting the role again of aldosterone, ADH, and ANP. This specific image is not on your exam. Same with potassium balance. Use this little diagram as a good understanding of how it's affected by, in this case, aldosterone, ADH, and ANP with sodium balance, and aldosterone specifically with potassium balance. And furthermore, this little more detail here with the action and effects of aldosterone. Again, that's pulling up in at least probably three different questions, aldosterone's role and effect. So this image is not specifically on your exam, but this content is vital. Certainly noting with the normal pH and how it's slightly alkaline, being 735 to 745, how pH is inversely related to hydrogen concentration, and how adding an acid increases it, of course base reduces it. And furthermore, and I think I have it here on another slide, but note the pHs where they can be fatal. What can be too low to be fatal for any lengthy period of time versus too high, which is in here somewhere. Basically, if you get below 7.0, going toward acid, or above 7.7, going toward alkaline, both can be fatal within hours. And then kidney response to maintain normal pH, how basically bicarbonate plays a role specifically, that's vital here, as well as the excretion of hydrogen into filtrate. As far as chemical buffers, note the different buffers and that bicarbonate playing the greatest role. But that said, within the ECF, I should say, bicarbonate plays the greatest role within the ECF, with phosphate and protein specifically more in the cells, but understand their basic role for chemical buffering. And again, the bicarbonate buffer system, the most important buffering system in the ECF. As far as conditions caused by acid-base disturbance, again, there's your pHs that are for basically acidosis below 735 and alkalosis above 745. But here, as I mentioned, I was hoping it was in here, with pH below 7 or above 7.7 is fatal within a few hours. That's important. Understand the general concept of acid-base disturbance. When buffering capacity is exceeded, the body can't buffer sufficiently, and consequently, there's a transient change in hydrogen, of course, with resulting in a change in pH beyond our normal range. And again, that can be fatal, let alone disturbances causing specific problems with compensation. You should understand that too. I did not highlight that. Compensation will show up and that is general concept there. It doesn't mean that, like I've said before, just this content means you're going to pass the exam. If you understood everything I highlighted here well, and understand what leads into it and what it leads to, you would do very well on your exam. So which means why I would suggest you go and look at this PowerPoint a little more deeply, and some of the content I left on there that's not specifically highlighted. I would still go over your content from your packet for sure. And also some of the information we covered in class with the POGAs and whatnot, be probably your last thing I'd focus more on. And then, of course, if you have time, it never hurts. It's never a bad idea to look over the images specifically in the chapters, because it gives so much good content for understanding concepts, specifically as it relates to any of the content, any of the primary terms that are mentioned here. If you do that, I would say, and study that quite well, you're almost guaranteed to do B or better if you study that, know that information well. I don't mean just be able to report what's said here in the PowerPoint, understand it well, okay? Hope this helps. A little review for you as well. I know the exam is tomorrow, but I want to give you something else to watch there for a little more recognition of how you're studying and how you're doing as well. That said, I'm sure you'll do well. Let me know how I can help you out.